The smoke alarm went off at 2:47 in the morning, and my first thought wasn't fire. It was my daughter-in-law. I lay there in the dark for 3 seconds, listening. The alarm in the hallway outside my bedroom, not the kitchen, not the basement, the hallway. And then I smelled it. Not smoke exactly, more like the ghost of something burned, something that had already finished burning before anyone was meant to notice. I got up, pulled on my robe, and walked to the hall. The alarm was still shrieking. I reached up and pressed the test button. It silenced. On the floor below it, a small pile of ash. Paper ash. The curled black remnants of something that had been fed to the smoke alarm intentionally, held up with a lighter until the detector caught. Someone had triggered it on purpose. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. My son and his wife were staying with me for the week, had been for 6 days. A family visit. My daughter-in-law had called it when she'd suggested it back in October. Your father shouldn't be alone so much, she'd told my son. He's 71. We should check on him, spend some real time. My son had called me, genuinely happy. Dad, we're coming for a full week. Like old times. Old times. He didn't know what she was doing. I was almost certain of that. Almost. I sat in the dark and thought about what I'd seen 3 days earlier. I'd been in my home office going through the quarterly reports for my investment accounts, the kind of routine I'd kept for 30 years. My son had knocked, poked his head in, said he and his wife were going into town for groceries. Did I need anything? I said no. They left. I heard the car back out of the driveway. 20 minutes later, I realized I'd left my reading glasses on the kitchen counter. I went downstairs to get them, and found my daughter-in-law standing at my desk in the office I'd just vacated. She had my filing cabinet open, the locked one. She hadn't heard me come back in. The kitchen door doesn't creak if you lift it slightly when you turn the handle, a trick I'd learned after 40 years in that house. I watched her for 11 seconds. She was photographing documents with her phone. My estate documents. The folder was labeled clearly. I'd never been a man who hid things inside his own home. Why would I? I lived alone. She put the folder back, closed the drawer, relocked it with the small key she'd somehow obtained, and turned around. She saw me standing in the doorway. Neither of us moved for a moment. I need my reading glasses, I said. She smiled. They're on the counter, she said. I saw them when I came back in for my jacket. I said I thought they'd gone into town. She said she'd forgotten her jacket. Came back. My son was waiting in the car. I said of course, and I walked to the kitchen and picked up my glasses. When I came back through the hallway, her face was perfectly composed. No guilt, no flushing, no over-explanation. Just a mild, patient smile. That told me more than the photographs had. I'd spent 22 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government. The last 11 of those embedded with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I had investigated fraud in amounts that would make most people's vision blur. I had looked at spreadsheets and seen crimes invisible to everyone else in the room. I had testified in federal court 47 times. I knew what a person looked like when they were caught doing something they'd planned carefully and weren't ready to abandon. She wasn't rattled. She'd simply shifted to the next contingency, and I had not said a word about what I'd seen, because I didn't yet know the shape of what she was planning, and you don't interrupt a pattern you're still mapping. The smoke alarm at 2:47 in the morning was part of that pattern. I went to my office the next day, while both of them were out on what my daughter-in-law called a morning walk. I checked the filing cabinet. Nothing appeared missing, but 2 folders had been returned in the wrong order. A small thing, the kind of small thing that only registers if you know exactly how you left them. Which I did. She'd been looking at my will and my beneficiary designations on my life insurance. I had a $1.4 million whole life policy I'd taken out in 1987, the kind they don't write anymore. My son was the primary beneficiary. His wife was not named anywhere. I sat down at my desk and thought carefully. My son was 44 years old. He was a good man, genuinely good. The kind of good that comes from a person who was never given a reason to be suspicious. He'd married her 4 years ago. I'd had reservations I hadn't voiced, because she was charming and my son was happy, and I didn't have anything concrete, just the instinct of a man who'd spent 2 decades watching people construct false narratives with a straight face. That instinct was now screaming. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I drove into town that afternoon, telling them I had a doctor's appointment, which was technically true. I did have one, just not that day. I went to see my attorney, a woman named Sandra Whitmore, who'd handled my affairs for 15 years. I told her what I'd observed. I didn't speculate. I laid out facts in the sequence they'd occurred, the way I would have written a case summary. Sandra listened without interrupting, which was why I'd always trusted her. When I finished, she said, "Do you want to change the documents?" "Not yet," I said. "I need to understand the full plan first. I need to know who else is involved." She looked at me carefully. "You think it's not just her. I think she doesn't have the financial knowledge to identify those specific documents without guidance," I said. "She's a dental hygienist. She's sharp, but she's not versed in estate planning instruments." Someone told her what to look for. Sandra nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" I told her. She agreed. We set it in motion before I drove home. That evening, my daughter-in-law made pasta. She was an excellent cook, I'll give her that. We sat at the table, and she was warm and funny, and asked me questions about my years with the government. The kind of questions that weren't quite as casual as they seemed. Questions about pension structures, about whether federal accounts passed outside of probate, about what happened to classified work contracts when someone died. I answered everything honestly, because honest answers given freely are less useful to a person building a case than answers they think they've extracted. My son talked about their plans to maybe buy a house outside Phoenix. They'd been renting. He seemed genuinely excited. I watched his face when he talked about it, open, animated, the same face he'd had as a boy when he described something he was looking forward to. He didn't know what his wife was doing in my office. I was now certain of that, which made what I had to do much harder. 2 days before they were scheduled to leave, I woke up at 4 in the morning with a specific feeling I'd learned to trust over decades. Not quite alarm, more like a shift in the air, the sense that something had moved that shouldn't have. I lay still and listened. My bedroom door was open an inch wider than I'd left it. I reached under my mattress and confirmed what I'd put there the day before was still there. It was. But I also knew it had been checked for, because the wrinkle I'd pressed into the fitted sheet on that side had been smoothed out. Someone had lifted the mattress corner and replaced it carefully. I got up. I walked to the guest bathroom at the end of the hall and took the small prepaid phone I'd taped inside the cabinet below the sink 3 days ago. I'd bought it in cash at a drugstore in the next town, told no one. I called my contact at the county sheriff's office. I'd known Deputy Harrington for 12 years, since he'd been a rookie assigned to a financial fraud case I'd consulted on. He'd done well. I'd told him so, in writing, to his lieutenant. He owed me nothing, but he picked up on the second ring even at 4 in the morning, because that was the kind of man he was. I told him I needed a welfare check arranged for the following afternoon, timed for 3 p.m. I told him what I suspected and what I had documented so far. I told him to bring someone from the financial crimes unit if he could. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you in danger right now?" I said I didn't think so. Not immediate danger. But I said it might depend on what they discovered when they went through my office computers tonight. He asked what was on the computers. I said what appeared to be on them was my full financial picture. Every account, every asset, every insurance policy. What was actually on them was a version I'd prepared 3 days ago with Sandra's help, a version that looked real and was accurate in almost every detail except one. In this version, my son's wife had been added as a co-beneficiary on the life insurance policy 6 weeks ago, a change that had not actually occurred, but that she had apparently been positioned to discover. Harrington was quiet again. Then he said, "You baited them." I said I'd created conditions that would accelerate the timeline if there was a plan, and I'd rather find out in a controlled situation than in an uncontrolled one. He said, "You've been doing this a long time." "Longer than I like to think about," I said. I put the prepaid phone back where I'd found it, went back to my bedroom, and lay down. I didn't sleep, but that was fine. I'd gone without sleep in worse situations than a comfortable bed in my own house. The next morning was ordinary in the way that mornings are ordinary when everyone at the table is performing normality. My son talked about a podcast he'd been listening to. My daughter-in-law asked if I wanted more coffee. I said yes. She poured it with a steady hand. She was very good. I'll say that plainly. Mid-morning, she said she was going to walk down to the mailbox and back for some air. My son said he'd come. She said, "No, you stay. Finish your coffee. I'll be right back." And she touched his shoulder in the way that reads as affection and functions as dismissal. She was outside for 14 minutes. When she came back, she said the neighbor's dog had gotten loose and she'd helped corral it. She was a little breathless. Plausible. When I checked my phone that afternoon, I had a text from a number I didn't recognize that said only, "Confirmed, 3 p.m." That meant Harrington had confirmed what I'd asked him to do. He'd also, I suspected, been doing some of his own checking in the interim, because Harrington had always been thorough. I made lunch. We ate. My daughter-in-law complimented the soup. At 2:51 p.m. I said I was going to walk out to the workshop to check on a project I had going. A 1969 Mustang Mach-1 I'd been restoring for 3 years. I said it casually, the way I'd said 100 ordinary things at that table in 40 years of owning that house. My son said he'd come have a look. My daughter-in-law said she'd clean up the lunch dishes and join us in a minute. I showed my son the Mustang. He ran his hand along the quarter panel, asked about the engine rebuild. We talked for a few minutes about compression ratios, and whether the original 4-barrel was worth trying to source. It was the most normal conversation I'd had in 6 days, and it nearly undid me, standing there with my son talking about carburetors while the rest of it circled overhead like weather. At 3:03, Harrington's patrol car came up the driveway. He had a second vehicle behind him, unmarked. My son turned to me. "Dad?" I said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, son. This is going to be a hard afternoon." He didn't understand yet. That was the hardest part. He didn't understand. Harrington came into the workshop, nodded at me, looked at my son, and asked if my daughter-in-law was inside. I said I believed so. He and the person from the second car went to the house. 2 minutes later, they came back out with her, and she wasn't in handcuffs, but she wasn't moving freely either. She looked at me across the driveway. Her face did something I hadn't seen it do before. The composure didn't slip exactly, but it relocated. She looked like a person reassessing the dimensions of the room she was in. "You knew," she said. "Since the filing cabinet," I said. "That was 3 days ago." "Yes, you could have just said something." "I could have," I said, "but I needed to know how deep it went, whether my son was part of it. And I needed documentation, not just my word against yours." Her jaw tightened. "He has nothing to do with this." "I know," I said. "I know that now." My son was standing between us, looking from one of us to the other. I watched the understanding move across his face the way weather moves across open ground, slow at the edges, then fast, then all at once. Harrington had pulled what he needed to pull. His colleagues at Finson, people I'd worked alongside for years, had spent the previous 2 days doing what they do well. What they found was this. My daughter-in-law had, over the previous 8 months, been in regular contact with a man who had been her college boyfriend. A man who was now a financial advisor in Scottsdale with 2 fraud complaints on his record that hadn't risen to criminal charges. He had guided her through what she needed to know about estate documents. He had coached her on what to look for, what to photograph, how to establish financial motive for what came next. What came next was the part that had kept me up at night. She had, 6 weeks prior, taken out a separate insurance policy on my life. A stranger-originated life insurance policy, the kind that is legal to purchase in some states under narrow circumstances, but that requires the insured's consent. My consent, which she had obtained on a document she'd slid in front of me on a visit in September, a stack of papers she'd said were related to a vehicle warranty she was handling for my son's truck. I'd signed it without reading it, which was the one failure in the whole sequence I had to own. I'd signed my own death warrant because I trusted my son's wife. The policy was for $800,000. She was the beneficiary. My son didn't know it existed. Harrington explained this to both of us, standing in my driveway in the cold November light. My son didn't say anything for a long time. He looked at his wife. She didn't look away from him. "I'll give her that too." "I didn't plan to," she said finally. "I mean, I didn't plan it all at once. It started as just finding out how much he was worth." My son's voice, when it came, was very quiet. "You were going to kill my father." "I didn't say that." "You took out a policy. You photographed his estate documents. You had a plan." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned to me. "Dad." "I know," I said. He walked to me and I put my arms around him, and he was 44 years old, but he felt like he was 9. I held on. Over his shoulder I watched Harrington read her rights. I watched her stand there in my driveway, composed even now, recalibrating even now, already thinking about attorneys and damage control and exit strategies. She was smart. She'd always been smart. But she'd made the mistake that almost everyone makes when they're building a plan against someone they've underestimated. She'd assumed that because I was old, and lived quietly, and fixed cars in a workshop and made soup for lunch, I wasn't watching. I was always watching. For 22 years, that was what I was paid to do. And then I stopped being paid and started just doing it, because it's how my mind works. Because patterns don't stop being visible just because you've stopped looking for them professionally. She was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and solicitation. The last charge because Harrington's team found text messages between her and the man in Scottsdale discussing what a death benefit payout would require and what the cleanest way to get there might be. She said those messages were theoretical. Her attorney was going to have a very long road ahead. The Stoli policy was voided. The state insurance commissioner's office got involved. It became, as these things do, a matter of record. The man in Scottsdale lost his license. 2 of the existing fraud complaints against him were reopened. My son moved into the house with me for 2 months after that. Not because I needed looking after. I'd made that clear. But because he needed somewhere to be while he filed the paperwork and processed the fact that the person he'd planned to build a life with had been planning something else entirely. We rebuilt the Mustang together. Took twice as long as it would have if I'd done it alone. Twice as long and worth every hour. One evening in January we were in the workshop and he asked me how I'd known. I told him about the filing cabinet, the key she'd obtained somehow, the specific folders she'd photographed. He was quiet. Then he said, "How did she get the key?" I said I'd been asking myself that. I thought probably the key hook in the kitchen, the one I kept visible, out of habit from years of living alone in a house where hiding things from yourself seems worse than hiding them from anyone else. He said I mentioned that once. The key on the hook. I told her about how organized you were, how you had a system for everything. I said I knew. He said I handed her the key. I said it wasn't his fault. That's not how blame works when someone deceives you. The deceiver carries it, not the deceived. That's the thing about trust. Extending it isn't a crime. Exploiting it is. He nodded, but I could see him still carrying it a little. Some weight you can't just set down because someone tells you to. Spring came. The Mustang ran for the first time in 4 years, the engine turning over in the workshop, while we stood there listening to it like it was music, because it was. My son had his hands in his jeans pockets, and he was smiling in the way people smile when something comes back that they thought was gone. A few months after that, I got a call from Sandra. The trial date had been set. My son and I would both need to testify. We went. We sat in the same courtroom on the same days, and told the truth in sequence, calmly, without embellishment, the way you tell the truth when you're certain of what you saw, and don't need to make it larger than it was. She was convicted on all 3 counts. The judge, in sentencing, noted the premeditation involved, the duration of the scheme, the targeting of a family member's trust. She received 14 years. My son didn't go to the sentencing. He said he didn't need to see it. I went alone, sat in the back row, and when the number was read aloud, I felt not satisfaction exactly, but something more like the completion of an equation. A thing that had needed resolving, resolved. I went home and made soup, ate it at the table where she'd poured my coffee. The house felt like my house again. That was 7 months ago. My son is seeing someone now, a woman he met through a colleague at work. Cautious about it, in the way that a person is cautious when they've been hurt at the foundation. I haven't offered opinions. I've asked questions, the kind that open things rather than close them. And I've listened. That's most of what parenting is, even when the child is 44. He came by last weekend to work on the car we're starting next, a 1972 Chevelle SS that I found through an estate sale in March. We were in the workshop going over what needed to come out first, and he said, out of nowhere, I keep thinking about the smoke alarm. The night you heard her testing the detector. I said I thought about it too. He said, what was she doing? Did they ever figure it out? I said the investigator's theory was that she'd been trying to test whether I slept heavily enough not to wake at a triggered alarm, whether a fire in the night might go unnoticed long enough. My son put down the wrench he'd been holding. I said it was a theory, not a confirmed finding. He said, but you woke up. I said I wake up at things most people sleep through. I said it quietly, without pride, because it isn't pride. It's just how I'm built. Something shaped that in me over decades, and I can't untangle which parts were there at the start and which parts were made. Doesn't matter much, in the end. He picked the wrench back up. He looked at the Chevelle for a moment. Then he looked at me. I'm glad you're you, he said. I said, hand me the socket set. He did. We went back to work.